first of all, thanks for having me. It looks like you guys are maybe in a shipyard. Looks like a very cool space. I am in Boston just for a couple days with an inflatable furniture system called the Bubbleware. Just here for a public event, bringing this inflatable furniture to try and infuse downtown Boston with a sense of play and collaboration between strangers, and just to sort of generally warm the environment here. But Boston is one of my favorite American cities, so when they called, I said yes.
Well, this sense of play, I think you sort of started with this. I mean, we've been, what now? Good Lord, hold on. Yeah, okay, good, this should be fine. We've been talking yesterday and this morning about this project, looking at post-carbon transition, and inevitably it leads to climate change and resource depletion and societal collapse and all of these wonderful, happy subjects. And we were talking a bit about the idea of play and how you can invite people into very difficult situations. And maybe you could just talk a bit about play and how that has shaped some of your approaches to what may be otherwise controversial topics.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which my projects at Rebar and now at Morelab can be looked at as a form of protest, right, and as a form of political agitation. And it's been my experience that when you want to make a sort of political point or an activist point, infusing a sense of play or fun or silliness into what you're presenting to people can make it easier for them to sort of understand your broader political point. It just makes it something that people can absorb a little more easily. They don't have to feel like you're opposing them politically. Play, I think, is a very powerful force, and one that frankly is lacking in most of our cities these days.
How did, with parking day, I mean, maybe just explain, I mean, it's easy to look at it and to say that parking day was about questioning the private use of public space or car dominance. How much of it was that for you, and how much was just let's do something fun?
A lot of it was let's do something fun, and a lot of it was what happens when citizens take action, when citizens take responsible action. How do the forces of power respond to something like that? But also it was about helping our city, right? This part of San Francisco where we did the first parking installation.
Super.
Can you hear me again?
Yeah, we hear you again. Yeah.
Okay, we're back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to keep going. I can't see you guys, but I'll just assume you tell me if you can't hear me. If there's a silence, I'll stop. In any case, so the first parking installation was in a part of San Francisco that the city itself had identified as lacking any park space. But at the time, there were no plans for the city to make any parks in this area. So we took it upon ourselves to sort of help the city out by making a temporary park in this area. And also to call, to call forth these larger issues about how much of our city is used by cars and how much of it is sort of available as recreational space for people. And I think, that idea of like the lack of pace, the way in which the city cannot keep up with cultural evolutions in its citizenry is an important point that sort of flows through all of our work, and definitely pertains to, automobile infrastructure. These days, we find ourselves living in a city that was designed 50 or 60 years ago when the automobile was the primary source of movement through the city. And we know that isn't sustainable, right? We know we can't keep using the car in the way that we have. So how do we start to reverse these planning strategies that have been in place for so many decades? Things more like bicycles and pedestrians.
Yeah, you disappeared, but then came right back. Matt, we can hear you.
Uh-huh.
It's just, I guess the signal's not strong enough for video at the moment, so it's.
That's fine.
All right, so maybe that's what we'll do. Is I'm just gonna leave the video off here, and maybe you can even just kill your video as well, and we'll just do sound, and
Sounds
maybe
good.
it'll be more consistent.
Yeah, sounds good.
We are actually in we're in a temporary structure on a big public square in Vienna, and it's
Cool.
created from shipping containers.
Uh-huh.
So it's a really nice space. The two downsides are that it's about 100 degrees today, and it's twice that inside. And
no.
that the internet signal doesn't really penetrate through the material here.
It's no problem. It's no problem.
Okay, so maybe talk as well about some of the projects you're working on now, reconceiving streets and sort of expanding from just looking at car space as parking space, but going into the streets themselves.
Sure. I mean, if you stop and you look at any sort of residential street in a city, you'll notice that it's just lined with parked cars, and that most cars spend most of their lives still just clogging up our streets. And so recently I've been working with a bicycle designer named Gary Fisher, who's one of the inventors of mountain biking in California. And he had a very popular bicycle brand, which he sold to Trek bicycles. And now Gary is interested in urban bicycle infrastructure. And that's something that I've been helping him explore. And the idea is basically begins with this premise that we know we can't keep using the car the way that we do. We know we can't continue to allocate so much of our streets to the automobile. And one of the most sustainable and practical ways of getting around a city is a bicycle. But for the most part, up until now, the bicycle infrastructure has been drawn on top of automobile infrastructure. So our project looks at, what would it be like if we designed urban bicycle infrastructure from the standpoint of the user and made the infrastructure, something that really is about the experience of being on a bicycle. And also, what if we invested the kind of money in bicycle infrastructure that we do in automobile infrastructure? What are some of the sort of, fantastic ideas that we could implement if we really started to put money into bicycle infrastructure? And if you think about it, like once you remove the automobile as the sort of primary motivation for designing your cities, all kinds of things can begin to change. First of all, the scale of the street and how much is allocated for people and for walking, pedestrians, and how much is allocated for transportation can be changed. And then the whole relationship between buildings, the relationship between the street and somebody's front yard and their house and their backyard can change. And one of the things that we're looking at with that is the totally car-free street. So looking at what happens if you remove automobiles from a street entirely, and sort of park the cars behind the houses or at the edges. How does urban planning start to change? How does our sense of the street and the scale of the city start to change when we start to extract the automobile just a little bit? And to me, the urban planning implications of that are enormous. The way that we experience our cities could change in a very profound way once we start to move away from the automobile.
What have some of the early findings been as you begin to think differently? What are some of the new approaches or new concepts, new ways of perceiving the street? Again, looking at removing a lot of the hardscape, making a more permeable street, so it becomes sort of an ecological corridor in addition to being a transportation corridor. Putting in more space for gardens and for pedestrians. There's just an enormous amount of space, on your average street because it's all drawn to the scale of the car. And so there's just an enormous opportunity.
So that's number one. And then number two, in the United States, and even in a city like San Francisco or Portland, which is pretty well known for its bicycle infrastructure, it's pretty clear that we're a good 10 or 20 years behind cities like Copenhagen or Amsterdam when it comes to not only allocating the funding for bike infrastructure, but also the design thinking and thinking about bike infrastructure as its own mode, as its own sort of form of infrastructure that deserves its own, its own space and its own financing and its own material to really sort of make it something that's focused on the use of the bicycle as opposed to what it's like here in the States, which is really just drawing bike lanes on top of asphalt, and also people are receptive, people are interested in these ideas. And some of our ideas are pretty fantastic, elevated bikeways through the city. But what it does for the bicycle advocates here is that it makes us look like these, freaky radical artists, and the bicycle advocates can then, put forth their plans, and they seem a lot more reasonable in comparison to what we're proposing. So there's sort of this political tactic at play here as well.
So this is just like how in the film industry, if somebody wants a certain rating, they'll just plug in a bunch of scenes that they know will freak everybody out so that they can extract those later just to get the rating.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Something to negotiate from, It's
right.
Like we propose putting a bike lane under the Golden Gate Bridge, and we'll see how people respond. But what's both telling and a little bit sad is that there was a lot more investment in bicycle infrastructure in the United States 100 years ago. There's a very popular but short-lived program called the California Cycleway, which was down in Los Angeles, and it was an elevated highway, an elevated toll road for bicycles only. And they built a few miles of it, and then eventually it was torn down and a freeway was built there. But this kind of thinking, we think that we're so sort of on the vanguard or on the cutting edge of urban design thinking when it comes to bicycles, but really we're not. Really, we're playing catch up and trying to get back to what things were before the rise of the automobile, in the 20th century. So it's inspiring to know that this has happened before, but also a little bit frustrating because, we realize that we're sort of fighting against powerful forces.
What are some of the ideas? I mean, it's, if we had never heard of cars, if somebody, came to Earth and saw all the infrastructure for cars now, all the things we think of as totally normal with these crazy flyovers and everything else, you would think that this was kind of insane. So in many ways, we're looking at that from this bicycle viewpoint where we typically provide almost nothing. So anything feels radical. But if you start from the perspective of the bike in cities, what are some of the ideas of
So in addition to totally car-free streets and elevated bikeways, looking at building paths through cities that have banked turns, or they're not just perfectly flat. They allow you to go a little more quickly because on the curves, the side of the bike lane will sort of curve up from the surface of the street and make a little elevated berm for you to turn on. So putting those kinds of little design moves, into bike lanes to make them a little more efficient. Also using wind, also looking at ways that you can harness the wind to give you a backdraft to get you pushed along, and then really looking at what sort of good faith investment in infrastructure could provide. Things like elevated bikeways, a totally dedicated path from the San Francisco airport into the city. Things along those lines. And then also, a big issue in California and in the United States is making bicycle infrastructure safe for children. So providing safe routes to schools and even, sort of critical mass type activities for kids who want to bike to school in the morning, getting together with a group and riding, as a group to provide more safety. So things that sort of work in a social context like that, all the way through sort of massive infrastructure projects. Probably the most radical is the one that I showed in Colombia, which is building a bicycle tunnel on the Golden Gate Bridge. If you look at the design of the Golden Gate Bridge, it was actually made for 2 layers of roadway, and right now there's only one on the top. But in the trestle, there's room for another road, and there was talk of putting trains there and making a separate automobile roadway. But we're really pushing to make it an enclosed bicycle tube with a cafe in the middle, which, as you can imagine, with the bridge that historic, is somewhat of an uphill battle. But again, if we make that the sort of radical edge, maybe we can make some of the less radical ideas seem a little bit more palatable.
Have you done research into the cost of some of these things? I mean, that's always to me one of the selling points of cycling infrastructure, is just if you want to look at the basic numbers of how many people can you move and at what price point, that cycling is just so much cheaper that it's often 1/20th, to 100th of the cost of car infrastructure. If you're talking about something like the Golden Gate Bridge, how much cheaper would it be to put this cycling infrastructure in than to put, for example, rail infrastructure?
Yeah, right. That's a good question. I mean, there's enough room actually to do both, to do a rail line and bike infrastructure. But yeah, it's significantly cheaper, and we have done a bit of research into that. And not only in the initial, fabrication, because the engineering is significantly different when you're engineering for bicycles versus cars, but also maintenance, right? The maintenance of a road and all of the weight of the automobiles, crushing asphalt repeatedly. It's significantly less in terms of maintenance as well. So, I mean, I don't know that we'll ever get away from sort of mass transportation, and not everybody in a city can bike, but if those of us who can have better infrastructure in which to do it, then people that are too old or sick to do it will have, a lot more space freed up for them to take buses or get around in some other capacity. So if you build the infrastructure, they will come.
Okay. Hey Matt, this is Flo. Hi. Do you hear us?
You stand back.
Is it really? Matt?
I can hear you again, yeah.
Okay, great. This is Flo. We were talking today also about how to make people convinced, or how to whet their appetite for like another vision, or like a paradigm shift when it comes to how we use our streets. In your experience, when you showed a project, or when you, I don't know if you yet presented it or talked to decision makers about it, what is your selling point to actually say, look, this could be a real option to build streets like that in the future?
Yeah, our selling point at this point is just to let us try it for a short period of time. Let's do a pilot project and just see how it works. That's been a very effective method in the States for quite a while now, because the most powerful argument you can make to somebody about why a bicycle makes sense in the city is to give them the experience of being on a bicycle in the city. So we're talking to folks in the transportation department in San Francisco about setting up some temporary pilot projects of some of these ideas. And just, instead of showing people renderings, let's give them the experience. Not everybody is an expert at looking at a rendering, but everybody is an expert at using the city. So let's meet them where they're experts and let them just try it out. And I think more broadly, the sort of political winds are shifting a little bit in the States. Definitely in cities like San Francisco and Portland and New York and Seattle, where the people that are in positions of power often bicycle themselves, and they get it. And so, a lot of times the ideas sell themselves, and it's really just about financing and funding. And so doing something like a pilot project or a temporary project is a pretty inexpensive way to build some, political will or some buy-in from the community about why this is a good idea. Let's just try it for a month or two and see.
Even with a pilot project, what are some of the obstacles? What makes even a pilot project difficult to enact?
Yeah, well, anytime you're going to make a change to the street, it's complicated, especially if there's buses and automobiles and taxis all using the same street. Um, and one of the reasons to do pilots is because anytime you do a more permanent change to the streetscape in California, and you have to do your environmental quality assessment, one of the main measurements of whether your project is going to be a success or not is, or one of the negatives is, do you affect car infrastructure? Do cars experience a loss of service because of your program? And so that means, at least for permanent projects, that doing changes like this that install bike infrastructure often run up against this sort of embedded preference for the automobile that's hard to overcome. But with pilots, the selling point is really, people come up to us all the time and say, "What are you doing? Why are you changing the street?" And we say, "Look, it's just for a couple months. It's temporary," and that almost always changes people's minds. If it's just temporary and it's just a trial, then people tend to be all for it.
Maybe any questions from the designers here? I think heat is sucking the questions right out of people's heads. It is really hot.
It's raining in Boston.
Nice. Will that affect your installation?
It might. It's early here, so I'm waiting to hear if we're still a go. But yeah, it might.
I just wonder, just to continue the thread that you were just talking about, with you have to sort of explain this loss of service.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That got a little wonky.
No. I mean, but how do you deal with, if one of the obstacles is, all right, fine, we'll let you do this this temporary installation, this temporary change, but we have to consider loss of service for cars.
Yeah.
What if the point is loss of service for cars?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the effort now, by brighter people than I, is to try and change that standard. Because if ever there was an outdated standard, it's that, But yeah, I know it's shameful, really, that in a state like California, the automobile is so embedded in the policy making. That yeah, I like that, though. I like the idea of going in and saying, "Look, that's precisely the point," is the loss of service. But until that changed, until the law changes, I'm afraid that would be a losing argument.
I wonder if you can reframe it, though, just in terms of it's not loss of service for cars; it's the question of mobility gains, or it's whatever. You reframe it.
Right, yeah, exactly. Like circulation, moving people versus just the fact that they're in automobiles. Yeah, that's a good idea. Just talk about, yes, mobility overall. Because if more people are on bikes, then the streets are less congested with cars too. Like there's a benefit actually to bike lanes, to getting people out of cars. It makes driving a more pleasant experience.
Maybe just ask you purely from a design perspective. When you go into designing, whether it's a parking day intervention or redesigning streets or any of these sorts of things, how much do you just play with design? How much do you try and set? These are the principles we want to embed. This is the message we're trying to send. I mean, I guess, how do you grapple with the aesthetics and freedom and creativity of the design process, and how it speaks to larger social issues?
Yeah, well, I think, first and foremost is the sort of policy implications. But yes, design is critical, and this is going to make Florian smile. You know, the persuasive power of good design is never to be underestimated. So it's critical that even pilot projects, even temporary projects, look like they're well designed. They look thoughtful, and they look, you know, like they've been designed and implemented with care. A few years ago in San Francisco, the city tried to do like it was almost like a parklet, like expand the sidewalk in Union Square, one of the shopping districts in San Francisco. And all they did was put out police barricades to block off a lane of traffic and to make that space for people to walk. But nobody understood that that's what it was. It just looked like weird and scary. And it totally failed. People would not step off the sidewalk because there was exactly zero design in the implementation of this idea. So yes, you have to remember the persuasive power and the political power of good design. That you really can persuade people by doing something, you know, that's aesthetically pleasing or beautiful or simple or elegant. It doesn't have to be high design, you know, it doesn't have to be any particular, it just has to, any particular sort of type of design or movement within design. It just has to be thought out and thoughtful design. And that's very, very powerful. So I guess to answer your question, really, it's both. It's making sure that the design is excellent and powerful, but that it's also, you know, in the service of the broader, you know, idea or political aim. Social aim.
Cool. Thank you, Matt. I think we'll we'll share the Parking Day manifesto that you sent, as well as the Pavement to Parks, you know, PDF, the guidelines.
Oh, great. Great.
And see how these might inform the process. Is there anything before we let Matt go?
You guys go get some ice cream or something.
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Matt. Good luck.
Sure.
I hope it stops raining. Good luck with the project today.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good luck, you guys. I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.